Okay, good morning everyone. Welcome to Friday, finally, right? Get a bit of a weekend, big weekend plans? Mm-hmm. Paper writing, Nicholas? Fun weekend?
Vikings.
Writing?
Vikings.
Vikings, okay. Preet? Fun weekend? Not really? You what? Oh. That's unfortunate. That's unfortunate. If I gave you a class next week to work on your paper, would you actually work on it?
Of course, sir.
Or would you just like go home and sleep in?
That's a good idea.
Would you work on it? Okay. Let me think about that, and maybe I can give you a class period on during next week
Yes.
to work on it. Yeah. Because I feel I feel bad sometimes because I don't want you to have to work all during the week and then all weekend as well, but also, you have to do some work outside of class. So let me think about it. Who is here? So Ryan is here. Good morning. Adel is here. Good morning, Adel. Sarah's here. Good morning, Sarah. And Abby's here. Good morning, Abby. And Simrat is here. Good morning, Simrat. Let's jump in where we were yesterday. And so what we said, of course, was that we were just tying up sexism at this point. We're, I think, ready to move on to racism, but I just wanted to, again, finish what we were talking about yesterday, do a quick summary, and then we can continue on, okay? So we were asking the question, of course, what stands in the way of women being equal to men? And in Canada, we found that we're not really doing that great. And if you look at some statistics, and we talked about statistics yesterday, you can see the evidence of this sort of society level oppression, the society level of sexism, right? And I said that's what we wanted to do. We wanted to not kind of look at individual experiences or certain articles from a newspaper that say this happened to this person, but we want to look at broader social patterns, right? And statistics allows us to do that, right? Statistics allows us to sort of measure what's going on for everyone rather than just, individual people, right? So we talked a little bit yesterday about just a couple of statistical terms and how they work, sample sizes and over and under representation and what the data actually tells us, right? And so maybe the best example of this was the grade issue, right? Or the testing issue. So if I want to know what you know in this class, if I ask you too few questions, I won't really get a good representation of what you know, right? So I know it's tempting to ask for one question on a final exam, but if it doesn't really tell me anything about what you know, it just tells me if you're kind of lucky enough to guess it or not. But the more questions I ask you, the bigger the sample size, the better measure I will get of what you actually know, right? The closer I will get to what your sort of true mark should be. We also talked about over and under representation. And so in a school with maybe half male and half female students, we would expect the number of A's to be roughly equal between men and women, right? But if there's a big difference, then it might cause us to ask some questions about why that is, right? Why is one gender achieving far more A's than the other gender, right? Is there discrimination going on? Are there barriers to one gender succeeding in the school? Are there external factors that are playing into this pattern that we see? Again, you have to ask the question. The statistics often, the statistics will tell you what's going on, but they won't explain why, right? So if we found, again, in the college, if we found that, women were getting most of the A's in the entire school, that's all it tells us, right? It doesn't tell us that female students are smarter than male students. It doesn't tell us that they work harder. It doesn't tell us that there's discrimination. It doesn't tell us any of those things. We have to actually figure it out, right? We have to figure out the reason why. The statistics just sort of tell us what's happening. Yeah, so we pay attention to what the data actually says, right? And the other example I gave you was that if 70% of people say they believe in ghosts, that does not prove the existence of ghosts, right? It just proves that people believe in them. So again, pay attention to the numbers, but also pay attention to what the numbers are actually saying and what they don't say. I won't go through all of this. Good morning. I won't go through all of this because we kind of went through it yesterday, but the story we were seeing is that violence in Canada and in the US is predominantly focused at women, particularly when you're talking about intimate partners. And so the numbers are quite shocking here in that really more than half of women have experienced some sort of physical or sexual assault. Most of those sexual assaults or physical assaults come from people that they know well, as members of their family or their intimate partner. And young people are predominantly affected, so young people are much more likely to be the victim of sexual assaults than older people. And race has something to do with it. Sorry, I'm going to jump ahead here. Race has something to do with it as well. And so women of color and Indigenous women are far more likely to be physically or sexually assaulted or to be victims of violence. And so there's an intersectionality there, right? These women are made more vulnerable, not just because they're women, but because they're women of color. We talked a little bit about mental health barriers, and the numbers are pretty shocking here as well, right? Again, these are big numbers. You would hope in grade 6 that most girls would feel that they're self-confident, but really only a third of them are. That seems pretty low, especially for grade 6 when girls are still pretty young, right? They're 10 years old. And by the time they hit grade 10, it's down to 14%. So most girls do not feel confident in themselves. There's pretty big numbers in terms of anxiety and depression amongst young women as well in society. More girls are hospitalized for mental health illnesses or mental health conditions, eating disorders, self-harm, anxiety, depression. All of these are much more common among young women. And again, that doesn't necessarily explain anything, right? The numbers just tell us that this is happening, right? And so we have to kind of do the work and figure out why, right? Why are women more often the victims of physical and sexual assault? Why are women suffering more anxiety and more depression than men? Why do they attempt suicide more often than men? Why do they self-harm at a greater rate than men? All of these things, again, the numbers don't explain anything, but they are the stimulus for us to ask the question, what is going on, right? Why are women suffering to this degree, especially in a society that is supposed to be equal, or that many people see as mostly equal anyway? One thing we didn't talk about yesterday was gender pay gap. And so you'll hear a lot about this in the media in terms of what women are paid and what men are paid. Depending on who you talk to, they'll calculate pay gaps different ways. Okay, so sometimes they'll compare annual earnings, so just how much money people make for part-time and full-time people, and they'll divide it up by gender. Sometimes they'll look at just the annual earnings of full-time workers, so they'll exclude part-time people. And sometimes they'll compare hourly pay of full-time working women to those of men. So they'll either divide it up by hour, they'll divide it up by year. Sometimes they'll look at part-time workers, sometimes they'll just look at full-time workers. But any way you kind of slice it, women still make less than men do. So if you compare it this way by annual earnings of full and part-time workers, you'll see that women earn 69 cents for every dollar that a man earns in Canada. And this is kind of the largest measurement that you'll get. Again, mostly because more part-time workers are women, right? Because again, even though we like to think we have gender equality here, most women are most likely the caretakers of children, right? They're the ones who get the kids up and get them dressed and fed and out the door to school. They're the ones who pick them up after school and bring them home. They're the ones who prepare the meals. And so a lot of women don't have time for a full-time job, and they only work part-time. Therefore, they're making less money, right? Far fewer husbands take part-time work in order to do this, right? This is almost exclusively women that do it. If you look at just the annual earnings of full-time workers in Canada, so if you exclude the part-timers, you still see that women make less. Only 75% of what men make, women make. Third, comparing the hourly pay of full-time working women to those of men. So if you divide up hourly pay, you still see a discrepancy here, right, of 87 cents. And so again, any way you kind of try to measure this, you see that women are paid less, right? And again, that doesn't really tell us anything except for the fact that they make less. The question is why, right? Why are women constantly earning less money on average than men are?
So it's not saying that employers are paying women less, right? It's just saying that they make less for some reason.
Well, that is the question, right? So again, this is where we have to do extra digging, right? This is where we have to figure out exactly what is going on. Because for one reason or another, women are taking home less money in Canada than men. And so why is that? Are men simply working in all the high-paying jobs and women aren't? Are there barriers to women entering those professions that are higher paid? If women do enter professions that are higher paid, are they discriminated against? In terms of part-time work, are women accepting part-time work more often than full-time work because they have responsibilities at home, kids and cleaning and cooking and things like that, right? Are there other barriers that we aren't thinking about, right? There's all kinds of things that may be happening here, and the answer is probably all of those things are happening to some degree. So yeah, that's the thing about the numbers, is that they tell us what's going on, but it doesn't tell us why, right? And so, can you think of any other reasons why these numbers might be the way they are? Why do women make less than men? What's that? Sexism? Well, yeah, that's kind of why we're talking about it here. Yeah. Yeah, they could have done that as well. They could have divided it up by profession. Good morning. Which probably would have made a little more. It probably would have given us a little more detail. One of the things that has been pointed out in terms of the gender pay gap is that on average, women, there seems to be more women in some professions than others, right? And so, lots of CEOs, lots of heads of companies, mostly men, right? Attorneys, lawyers, I think still mostly men, but maybe not quite so much. Engineers, mostly men. Hard scientists, mostly men. So the thing is that the criticism or the idea was that women on average tended to choose jobs that were lower paid. So, you have most nurses are women, most teachers are women, right? And so there was this idea, well, women seem to be drawn to these occupations, right? Teaching, nursing, things like that. Women tend to be drawn to these occupations that actually pay less, right? And so that's why. That's why they make less, because they're just drawn to. They just happen to be drawn to professions that don't make as much money. Which, whether that's true or not, is hard to say, right? There could be other barriers that prevent them from getting into engineering and technology and stuff like that. But the other thing is that why are some occupations paid so well?
Because they do study for it.
Yeah, but teachers have to study too, as do nurses. And nurses have a hell of a difficult job, as do teachers. And yet,
Could some be more needed in society?
what's that?
Some are more needed in society.
Some are more needed in society? Yeah, some are more needed in society, but who's kind of setting those priorities? Well, men are, right? Because again, men are in control of society, right? Men are running government, men are running companies. Men decide what is important and what is not, right? And I think, when the pandemic started about a year ago, I think we all kind of, for a second, maybe not permanently, but I think we all kind of recalibrated who was essential to our lives, right? And suddenly we realized that, oh, grocery store workers are actually very important because we need to buy food and toilet paper, apparently. I still don't get that. But we needed to buy that stuff. We needed those people to work in grocery stores so that we could actually eat, right? And so people that, nobody thought twice about the day before, those people suddenly became very important, right? And so, are teachers not important, right? I think they are, because when schools closed for a short period of time, suddenly parents had to somehow educate their kids, which they weren't trained to do and they struggled with. Plus, parents were trying to do their own job while looking after their kids at home, and that was chaotic and that didn't work. And so people need teachers in schools as well, but they don't really compensate them that way. Sorry, I shouldn't. Obviously, there's some bias here because I am a teacher, but it's interesting to think about, even if you accept the idea that, oh, well, women just by choice seem to enter professions that are paid less, the question is why are they paid less? The profession has higher supplies?
Yeah,
Like there's more of them?
Grocery workers don't need PhD to work as anyone can work at.
Hmm.
And if you're a doctor, you need a PhD.
Yeah, so there's some merit to that, right? The idea that certain professions need more training. They're more difficult to do, right? Open heart surgery is not the same as working in a grocery store, right? That's intuitively, we intuitively know that, right? But yeah, and I'm not questioning that necessarily, but I am saying, I'm just asking, is it true that women just seem to go into professions that pay less? And is it true that those professions actually should make less? That's all maybe the grocery store thing wasn't a good example, but that's all I'm asking here. Again, and those are the questions you kind of have to ask, right? Even if the answer is, well, no, right? Even if the answer is, okay, well, that's not an issue or that's not happening. When you see numbers like this, you have to ask the question, right? Why are women being paid less than men? And these are big numbers, right? This is Statistics Canada, and that's the branch of the government that keeps tabs on the numbers of everything in Canada, right? So this is a giant sample. This is a sample of 20 million people. It's huge, right? So if a sample size of 20 million says that women are making, somewhere between 70 and 87 cents on every dollar that men make, I think it's a good idea to ask, why is that? Right? What is going on? Why are women not compensated at an equal rate to men? Right? Again, I'm not suggesting an answer, but I am saying it's worth asking the question. Know what I mean? Okay, so quick summary of sexism, because this has been a big unit, we've talked about a lot. We said that sexism was an unequal relationship in society between a dominant gender and a minoritized gender. In this case, men and people of other genders, women, trans men, gender non-binary, gender fluid, all of those people make up the minoritized group. If you remember our little genderbread person here, we talked about biological sex, we talked about gender expression, gender identity, who people are sexually attracted to and romantically attracted to, and I tried to convince you that all of these are to some degree separate, in that we can't really assume because we see someone and they look like a man or they look like a woman to us, we can't really assume anything about them, right? In terms of what their gender identity is, who they might be sexually or romantically attracted to. We can't really assume those things, right? That said, heterosexual cisgender people are probably the most common, right? Most people are cis men or cis women. They're mostly heterosexual. That's probably the most common case, but it doesn't describe everybody, right? And again, the less comfortable or the less safe that people are expressing aspects of their gender identity or their sexual identity, the less comfortable or safe people are, the less we're going to know about it, right? So if it's not safe in society to express different gender identities or different sexual identities, you're going to see a whole bunch of cisgender straight people, right? That's all you're going to see, because that's all that's safe. That's all that it's safe to be, right? But the more kind of open a society becomes, the more safe it is for people to express what they're feeling and what they're thinking. Yeah, you're going to see people who vary from that common state, right? And so all of these things are kind of in play, but they also have they're strongly dependent on what a culture will allow. And again, if you have a culture that's very permissive, you're going to see people with different gender identities and different sexualities. In a country that's very repressive of those ideas and with harsh punishments, you're probably not going to, good morning, you're probably not going to see those things, right? Because it's too dangerous. But again, just because if you're in a time or in a country where homosexuality is forbidden and illegal, it doesn't mean there's no gay people. It just means that they're hiding, right? So we said that regardless of what our sex assigned at birth is, all of us are going to be born, all of us have been born into societies that have gender roles, right? And the societies we've been born into, some of those gender roles might be a little bit different in some ways, they might be a little bit the same in other ways, but all of our societies are going to try to push us to behave in the gender that we've been assigned. Good morning. I also tried to point out to you at one point that a lot of the aspects of our gender roles they're cultural, but they're also socially constructed, right? So not everything has to do with biology. Many people, when we talk about gender roles, I think we often kind of combine the cultural ideas that we have about men and women with the biological, and then we just assume that it's all biology. That's just how men are. That's how women are, and it's not entirely true, right? There are biological differences between men and women, obviously, but culturally speaking, I think there's far more cultural construction around what it is to be a man and what it is to be a woman than there is biology. We looked at some media. We looked at oh gosh, what do we look at? We looked at toys, we looked at advertising for food and for cigarettes, we looked at movies, we looked at music video, and one of the things we said is that sometimes in movies, but particularly in advertising, the thing we see is stereotypes. People will market stereotypes to us over and over again because they're safe, everybody knows what they are, and they're what we expect to see, and we don't question them, right? We see the thing that we assume to be true, and then the advertiser can focus on, again, laundry soap or whatever they're trying to sell, right? They don't want to confuse you. We looked at some popular culture, we looked at movies, we talked about romantic comedies. Again, I'm sorry for ruining those. We looked at some Harrison Ford movies, we looked at the Big Bang Theory. I'm sorry if I ruined the Big Bang Theory for you, but some people would argue it's not ruinable. And what we saw was, even though all of those things were quite popular, so the romantic comedies, super popular, Harrison Ford movies have been super popular in the past, Ariana Grande is super popular, some of those have sexist messages and problematic messages sort of mixed into them, right? And sometimes they're hidden sometimes those sexist messages are hidden in a way that they come from the hero, right? We know the hero of the film or the show we know he's the good guy, right? And so we know he would never do anything bad. And so we kind of give him a bit of a free pass, right? We let him get away with behavior like Harrison Ford because we know he's the good guy, right? He's not a creep. He's the hero, right? But he behaves badly, and because the story frames him a certain way, we let him get away with it, right? On the Big Bang Theory, we saw that it was framed in terms of a bunch of harmless nerds, right? So these harmless nerds could say sexist things and do creepy things that made women feel unsafe, but it was okay because they're harmless, right? It's okay, you guys, they're harmless, right? Which, again, if you watch the show, they are, right? None of them are really, they're not bad people, right? None of them would hurt anyone. But, again, that's the difference between television and real life, right? In television, we know that these characters are harmless, nice guys who would never hurt anyone. But in real life, we don't know that, right? Real life is quite obviously different. And yeah, when people behave that way, it's damaging, right? Yeah, so we talked about misogyny. That was the Big Bang Theory. We talked about the Ariana Grande video, and I don't know that I feel like we kind of agreed to disagree on that one. But I asked you to think about the degree of sexiness in that video, and again, it's a difficult question to ask, particularly of entertainment like that and pop music. How do we know if a woman is in a music video dancing around in very little clothing in a very sexualized way? What's going on? Is she being exploited by the industry? Is she selling her body, devaluing herself? Or is she expressing her sexuality in an empowered way? What's going on? And how do we know, right? What is the difference between one thing and the other thing? Right? And again, I don't have the answer to that one either. And so with Ariana Grande, I tried to bring that question up to you. What's going on, right? Is she portraying herself, is she selling her sexuality to help her music career? Or is it simply empowered feminism? I'm not sure. I'm not sure. But it's worth asking the question. Let's see. Oh yeah, we talked a little bit about why women and men are unequal to begin with in many societies, and so we talked about we saw a TED Talk by Christopher Ryan, and he said that, well, one of the issues here is that, not an issue, but one of the things he discovered in his book was that human sexuality is first and foremost a means of creating and maintaining social relationships. Christopher Ryan argues that we are not pair bonders, we're not monogamous creatures. Of course, we can choose to be, right? But he says that's not really how and why our sexuality evolved the way it did. But he said monogamy did become very common in societies because of agriculture. Whoops, do I have a slide on that? No. Because of agriculture, right? The necessity to pass down land and wealth from father to son made it important to make sure that a man's son was actually his, right? And 3,000 years ago, there's no way to do that unless you tightly control people's sexuality. And so in a lot of societies that have agricultural roots, agriculture in the past or present, or sometimes pastoralists as well, they will have very strong, rigid controls around sexuality, right? No sex before marriage. Once you're in a marriage, there's only sex with your husband or wife. If your husband or wife dies, there's no sex after that either. Very strict, very controlled to ensure that that a man's children are actually his, right? And so in the process of that switch to agriculture, women kind of lose their role in productivity. They lose their role in kind of providing food for people. They're kind of confined to the household to give birth to and raise children. But also, again, their freedoms and their sexual freedoms are restricted in a way that almost leads them to be property in some cases, things that men own. We said that one of the ideas that's linked to that was the patriarchy, right? From two Greek words, patris and archon, father and ruler. And this was kind of the belief that men are superior in some way and just kind of deserve to be, or just, that it's of course inevitable that men would be in charge, right? And so we see evidence of that all through society. Oh, right. That's the slide I was looking for before. But we say that this patriarchy, this ability of men to be in charge, has allowed them to enforce their prejudices through society, right? And maybe that's the question I was asking you a little bit before in terms of the gender pay gap, right? Why are nurses and teachers paid less than, I don't know, engineers? Yeah, we need engineers to do a good job, right? We need them to build bridges that don't collapse. I mean, that's clearly true. But do we not need good nurses? Yeah, if I go into the hospital, I want a good, competent nurse. I don't want someone sticking needles and tubes in me that doesn't know what they're doing, right? That's bad. Teachers, if I have a child, I'm gonna send them to school. And do I want them educated by some bozo? No, I want them educated by someone who is properly trained and is good at their job and is caring and loving and supportive. That's who I want. And that's worth paying for, I think. So again, I don't want to enforce too much of my bias on you, but again, sometimes it's worth asking the question of why do we pay professions the way we do? Training has something to do with it, absolutely. There's a difference between an open heart surgeon and a cashier at a grocery store, no argument. But, how we pay people says a lot about what our values are. And who gets to say what those values are is a question, which I think you know the answer to, but I'll just leave it. We said that when we're looking at oppression, any oppression, not just sexism, it's not about numbers. It's about institutional power. And again, women, even though they've been about 50% of society for ever and ever, unless you go to China, of course, where the one-child policy has kind of tilted things. But in most societies, at least 50% of citizens are women. And yet, they still don't hold power. And again, that means that oppression's not about numbers. It's not necessarily majorities and minorities, although it can be. Here it's about who has the power to affect change. So really what we're trying to do here is restore some sort of, I'm saying equality here, but really some sort of equity, right? Some sort of ability to have people of different genders having equal opportunity and equal rights in society. We don't want barriers holding certain people back just because of gender, just because of who they are. And so we talked about this yesterday and today. I won't sort of go through it again, but I think the story there was that if we look at the statistics, if we look at the big numbers from society, we do in fact see that women are suffering, women are disadvantaged, there are a lot of economic and health and safety outcomes that women do far worse in, right? They don't make as much money as us men. They are not as safe in society. They are not as mentally healthy in society. They are the victims of violence, sexual and otherwise, far more often than us men are. And again, the question that needs to be answered is, what is going on? Why is that the case? And how do we fix it, right? How do we remedy those things? Yeah, I think that's all I have to say on sexism, but is there anything that we missed or that we should talk about in regard to?
What's the word for society where all genders have equal power? Is there patriarchy and matriarchy?
Where you have where any person of any gender would have power?
Yeah, most people.
Ooh. I don't think there is a word for that as far as I'm aware. Patriarchy is where men are in charge. Matriarchy is where women are in charge. Okay, not just Pacha. I guess you could say it's an anthroarchy. Humans are in charge. That sounds a little. That sounds like a made-up word, because it is. What else could we say? Humanarchy? I don't think there's a word for it. Not yet, anyway. Maybe once we actually achieve it, then we'll be able to give it a name. Do you think that's possible? Do you think it's possible to achieve a society in which one particular gender does not have control of the others or does not have power over the others? Is it possible to have a society that's not necessarily divided along gender lines? We could, well, we can't, but hunter-gatherers did have a lot of things figured out. Do you think we should just get rid of gender altogether? Just let people be who they are? No gender roles? We'll just throw them out? What do you think? Just throw them out altogether?
There's not still also racism and sexism, so I could say it's not possible from my end.
Well, it's certainly difficult, right? We know that gender roles are a deeply held part of culture, and so they are difficult to change, right? Even minor changes take a long time, right? So it is difficult to throw them out the window. There are some parents now who are new parents who they have a baby and they try not to raise them in a gendered way. So they try not to enforce, they try not to buy them boy toys or girl toys if they're a boy or girl. They don't dress them in pink or blue. They try not to tell them what they should be like in terms of, this is what a little boy does or this is what a little girl does. They try not to give them any gender instruction, if you will. They try to raise them gender neutral. Do you think that's a good idea?
We'll see the result in 18 years.
What's that?
We'll see the result in 18 years.
We'll see the result in 18 years, probably. Less than that. People have been doing it for a few years, so. I don't know. Do you think that's a good idea or a bad idea? Good idea? Yeah, so when maybe when the as the kid grows up, they will decide what's best for him or her or them.
Yeah.
What? It's not
a good
possible?
idea, but it's impossible.
No, it's like it opens up the mind. They don't have that thought that a woman has to work at home and a man goes out. They have a broad mind.
Sure, maybe their sort of possibilities for their life might be more broad, right? If they're not just looking at this is what men do, this is what women do. Although, granted, here in the West, gender roles are kind of a little more fluid than they have been in the past. But still,
But even our nature is different.
their nature is different. Your nature is different. Well, maybe that's an open question, right? About what is the nature of men versus women? Are all men the same? Are all women the same in some ways, or not so much? I don't know. Yeah, I think it's an interesting experiment, although I don't know I'd want to experiment on my child. But to be honest, and I don't have any experience with this, and I haven't done any reading on it. But I suspect it won't matter, because, like most things, that this child is going to go out into society anyway, right? And so you might try to raise them at home as gender neutral, but one of the themes of this whole course is that we absorb social messages when we go out into society, right? And we absorb them without even realizing it, right? So is this kid going to watch TV from time to time? Or maybe YouTube or Netflix? Yeah, they are, right? Are they going to go to school with a bunch of other kids? Yeah, are those kids going to be socialized according to gender roles? Yes. Is your kid going to watch movies and TV and watch other people in society? Of course, right? Do kids know their gender identity? Think back to the T word. They do, right? Even when their parents are trying to socialize them to the opposite gender, right? So, you remember Zoe, the young girl who wore pink all the time? She's very girly and very pink from the T Word documentary. Yeah, and so Zoe's mom was socializing her as a little boy because her sex assigned at birth was male, right? So her mom didn't know any better and was, treating her as a boy. And then Zoe said one day, yeah, I don't think this is me. I think I'm this thing over here. I'm a girl, right? So even if you try and go the opposite way, kids kind of figure it out anyway. So I don't know. Again, I don't know anything about parents who are trying to raise their kids gender neutral or non-gendered or whatever, but I honestly don't think it'll work because like the force of socialization out here in the world is too great, right? You can't overcome that unless you just never let them out of the house, and never let them watch anything. But if you do let them out of the house and you do let them watch things and interact with other people, they're going to start being socialized by society anyway. It's probably not a bad idea to start off in terms of, allowing an open mind. But I think kids figure out who they are, and they also figure out how to fit themselves in to the world around them. And so I don't think there's anything you can do. Humans are not wired for much, but we are wired to learn, and we are wired to find a way to fit in with our social peers, because we're social animals, right? We cooperate with each other. So I don't think there's anything you can do. But we'll see in 18 years if I'm right or not. Okay. Anything else about sexism before we move on to racism, which apparently everyone's been waiting for? Okay, let's take a little break. When we come back, Racism 101. Okay, and we are back. So, starting a new section here, something that's obviously been in the news quite a bit over the past year and will continue to be in the news for the next year, I'm sure. A topic that's probably, I would say it's probably the most emotionally charged oppression that we could talk about. I mean, we talked about ableism and sexism. We talked a little bit about heterosexism, if you will. We'll try to talk about classism before the end. Of all the things that we could talk about, I feel like this is the touchiest subject, right? This is the one that gets people more kind of emotionally charged, and for good reason. But we'll unpack that as we go. Before we kind of dig into this, I wanted to ask you a few questions and just see what you knew and what you thought, what your opinions were. And so maybe the first question I'll ask you here is what is race?
Yeah, I've always wondered about that. Because I thought white people were just a race. Like,
You thought we were what?
just one race.
Us white people?
Yeah.
Well, that's I don't want to spoil it, but okay. So there's the question of, if you look at white people, are we all one race, us white people? What else? Based on what you kind of know or have experienced, what would you say race is? It's related to where you come from. Certainly that is true, right? Certain races, quote unquote, have certain geographical origins. We can say that for sure. Are they the same thing, race and ethnicity? Good question. Spoiler alert, no, but we'll get to that in just a minute. What's that? They're not? No. Not the same thing. It's interesting now, maybe you're all shy, but racism is a big thing, right? People talk about it quite a bit, but we're kind of having trouble saying what it actually is, which is interesting to me. Although sometimes defining something is the hardest thing, but interesting question, yes. What about this next question here? What do you know what race you are? If I asked you, if I gave you a survey and I said, please write down your name, Mulder. Please write down your race. Would you be able to write something? Maybe. Good question. Is Asian a race? Maybe. Nicholas, what would you write in the little race box? Okay. Not. Yeah. So what would you write then? You're human. Okay. I don't know if the government will like that.
Human race.
Yeah.
That's the best thing I thought. Like, I thought it's ethnicity and race.
Right. Yeah. It's confusing, right? Whatever kind of race you think about yourself as, who gets to say? Who gets to say what your race is? Biology gets to say? Society gets to say? Who's in charge of determining what race someone belongs to? Is it you? Is it society? Is it the government? Good question, right? If my grandfather or maybe great grandfather, if I told you that my great grandfather was a black man, can I identify as black? Or if I had a great grandfather who was indigenous, perhaps, Can I identify as an indigenous person? And are those two things different? It's complicated, right? Can you change races? Can't switch? You are what you are? Which is interesting because apparently someone gets to say who you are, and then apparently you can't change. So who gets to say? You get to say, but you can't switch. Is it not biology? How about this? Is race meaningful? What? Why is it meaningful? Okay, so one of the things we've said about humans is that humans really want to belong to a group, right? They really want to feel like they're part of a bigger group of humans. That's an important need that humans have. Race, to some degree, might do that, right? It might make you feel like you're one of a people. Yeah, it's part of your identity. It's part of who you are, right? Definitely true. Why else is it meaningful? Why is race meaningful?
Back in the old days, you can identify who's tribe and who's not.
Sure, you can. Part of human cooperation and is sharing, right? But also part of it is knowing who you don't share with, right? You've always got a group of people who are on the inside, right? People that you share and cooperate and work together with, and then there are other people that you don't, right? That you don't owe anything to, and I guess race could be a dividing line between who's in the group and who's outside of it. Sure. Or is it not meaningful? It's not meaningful? What? No idea? You say it is meaningful. Okay. So identity, kind of group membership, cooperation, any other reasons why race is meaningful or not? Okay. Can I define it? Yeah. Let's answer a few of these questions here because we are struggling, and it's okay to struggle because, again, despite the amount of attention that racism gets, there's not a lot of good discussion about it. And actually, that's what one of the things I was going to bring up before we dug into this was that, I think part of the reason why, that there's so much kind of emotional reaction to racism, not that it's not a bad thing, because it absolutely is, but part of the problem is that people aren't really sure what it is, and they're not really sure how it works, and they're not really sure what they're talking about sometimes. And so I think that plays into people's ability to say the wrong thing, right? Particularly on social media, if you say the wrong thing, but it also plays into people's pattern of then dogpiling onto that person and just saying the most awful things about them if they should happen to slip up. And again, I'm not giving a free pass to people who are blatantly racist. You should be called out for that. People should be outraged. But sometimes people don't phrase things very well, or they make a bad comparison, or they say the wrong thing, and then there's an explosion around that. And again, I think it has to do with people maybe not really understanding what they're talking about. Maybe they're using wrong terminology. Maybe they don't understand their history. Maybe they don't understand how racism actually works, right? And so there's a lot of kind of emotion and that happens in connection with this. And so I think that's part of it. So let's then move on and talk about what these two things are. So the question, are race and ethnicity different? And for our purposes here, they definitely are. So race, we're going to say it's a social distinction. Notice I'm not saying it's a biological distinction. It is a social distinction based on what we see of other people, right? And certain races are usually defined by skin color, eye shape, hair, how our hair grows, sometimes the shape of our face. Certain features will be in a certain, bigger or smaller or in a different configuration. Those things are what leads people to classify others into races, right? So race is a social category, not a biological category, a social one. Ethnicity here, as you can see, is rooted in cultural difference, right? So it has to do with your belonging to a culture. It has to do with you coming from a certain part of the world. It has to do with you belonging to a group of people that have a similar language, a similar history. That's kind of your ethnicity, right? And those things sometimes overlap with race, and then sometimes they don't. Okay, but they're not entirely the same thing. They're not the same thing at all, really. Now, again, one of the questions that came up was, is race biological? We often think of race in biological terms, and in part that's reasonable, right? Because if we're looking at a white man, like you all are right now, the reason I am white, it's like from Mean Girls, right? Oh my God, Karen, you can't just ask people why they're white. The reason I am white has to do with my genetics, right? I carry genes that codes for my skin color, and this is what it is, unless I spend a lot of time in the sun and then it's a little darker. But still, there's a biological aspect to the color of my skin, right? But that doesn't necessarily mean that race is biological in itself, okay? So everything that is us, right, the entire way that our bodies are and they appear and that they operate has to do with our genetic coding, right? And this is probably not a surprise. We all know about DNA, and we know about genes, and genes code for certain particular things, right? You inherit those genes half from your mother, half from your father. They inherited their genes from their parents, and so on and so forth, right? Oh yeah, and a helpful little diagram of a human's 23 chromosomes, right? So this is where all your genetic information is encoded. Here you can see if you're a female, you have 2 X chromosomes. If you're a male, you have an X and a Y chromosome. But this is kind of this is the building blocks of what humans are, right? But if you look at that genetic coding, if you look at the human genome, what you'll find is that really there are no genetic races within humans. In biological terms, if you're looking at a race of organisms, whatever kind of animal or whatever you have, a race of organisms is usually a group that has been separated out from most of the population, right? So imagine you had a group of crows, for instance, these black birds flying around. If you had a group of crows and you trapped a bunch of them and you took them out into the middle of the Pacific Ocean and you planted them on an island where it was too far for them to fly off, they just had to stay on the island, what would happen is that eventually that group of crows would kind of evolve into their own race of crows, right? They'd probably be very similar to the crows here, but they'd be genetically a little bit different. They'd probably be on their way to becoming a different species, but they're kind of genetically isolated, they're genetically unique, and they're kind of they're on their own evolutionary path because they're separated from the larger group. Now, that's happened with animals, and plants throughout the history of the earth many times, but it doesn't really define what's happened with humans. Humans have always been very migratory. We've always moved around, and we've lived in basically every kind of environment that the earth can offer, right? There's people living in the far icy north, there's people living in deserts, there's people living in mountains and rainforests and on the coast and on the plains and in the valleys and on the mountains, and people live everywhere, and we move around a lot. And so there's really never been a group of people that have been so genetically isolated that they don't interact with others. We've always interacted with other humans, and when we interact, we kind of, right? So so we have interbred with other humans for our entire history, and so human beings don't really have any communities that are genetically isolated from each other. We've always been one big gene pool, so to speak. The other thing that they notice when they look at the human genome is that there's more variation within a race than between races. Okay, so if I take Amanpreet for an example here, Amanpreet, I'm going to guess that your ancestors at some point came from India, right? Indian subcontinent somewhere. Fair assumption? Okay. My ancestors, I actually have my genetics tested because I was curious. My ancestors come from Northern Europe, so mostly England, Ireland, a little bit of Scandinavia and stuff like that. So that's where my genes come from. Your genes come from a different part of the world. But if we were to analyze our genetic coding, and let's just throw Sarah, the head of secondary, let's throw Sarah in the mix here as well. If we tested my DNA, and Sarah's DNA and your DNA, what we actually might find out is that you and I might be more genetically similar than Sarah and I. Even though Sarah and I are both white and our genes come from Europe in general, she's Italian, so her genes are a little bit different, but even though she and I come from a part of the world that is much closer together, you and I actually might be more genetically similar. So the genes that mark different races, so our skin color, maybe eye shape, maybe the way our hair grows, maybe the shape of our face in some sort of way, those genes are actually, there's very few of them, right? So there's billions of base pairs in the human genome, and there's like a handful that code for skin color or eye shape or the way your hair grows. And so those genes tend to be connected to a certain part of the world, right? And so most people who come from China have a certain distinctive shape of their eye, right? Or most people who come from Eastern and Southeast Asia have a reasonably similar shape to their eye, and those genes kind of code for that. And those genes are persistent in that area of the world. But you're kind of talking about a couple of genes, like a few, right, in billions of genes on the genome. So is there a difference? Yes. Is it a significant difference? No, right? In terms of humans, it seems significant because we're such visual creatures, right? That's how we take in information about the world, is we look around and we look at other people and try to figure them out that way. And so when we see someone who has a different eye shape than us, it almost seems like that's a big deal, right? To the human brain that is so visual, it seems like that's a big difference, right? But really, genetically speaking, nothing, right? Keep in mind that you and a bonobo are about 99% similar in terms of your genetics, or a chimpanzee for that matter. So if you and a chimpanzee are 98 or 99% similar, you're talking about a minuscule difference between different races. The only difference is that, again, humans are such visual creatures, they kind of overestimate the importance of that difference, right? If I'm sitting here, a white person, and a black person is sitting across from me, it seems like that's a big difference, right? Their skin is a totally different color than mine. That seems like a big difference to my human brain, but genetically speaking, it's not that big a difference. There's a couple of genes that code for that, right? It's melanin production, right? The other thing we should mention about some of those genetic adaptations or genetic features is that often they have to do with their environmental adaptations. So do you know why this skin color evolves? It's something to do with sunlight, yeah. So in order for your body to synthesize vitamin D, which it needs to do, it needs sunlight to pass through your skin. That's what helps catalyze that reaction to produce vitamin D. And so if you come from, say, equatorial Africa, which is where all humans come from, that's no problem, right? There's lots of sun around the equator, you're good. If you happen to, over generations, if human beings migrate to northern Europe, which they do, well, northern Europe, as you might imagine, is colder and not as sunny and cloudy and rainy and gross. And so you're not going to get as much sunlight. And so the sort of really dark skin that Africans have isn't really an adaptation for northern Europe. You won't get enough vitamin D. And so what happens? Well, you get a mutation that makes your skin kind of somewhat transparent, right? So you can absorb the very little sunlight that you find in northern Britain, right? But again, if you go to equatorial Africa, getting sunlight into you is not the problem, right? What you need is protection from the sun. And so people's skin around the equator tends to be a little bit darker because it's an adaptation to lots of sun. People from more northerly climates, their genes tend to be for lighter skin because it allows that sunlight to come in. Again, is that a biological difference? It is, right? It's coded genetically. Is it a big deal? Not really, right? It makes a difference in how people appear and how people look, but in terms of real genetic difference, it's basically nothing, right? If you look at human beings' genomes, there are differences. There are, obviously there's differences because we're all unique genetic individuals, but really we're basically the same person. There's really not that much genetic variation amongst human beings. And in fact, do I have that? No. Maybe it shows up in the article I'm going to have you read, but in some cases there is more genetic variability within a single group of chimpanzees than there are amongst human beings. So again, the differences that the differences that humans have encoded in the idea of race, those biological differences are basically meaningless. Race is a social construction, right? And it's based on a few adaptive genes that we have inherited from our ancestors. A lot of those adaptations are environmental adaptations. So hair, for instance, the really curly hair that Africans have, it's great when you're in a hot climate because it allows air to circulate closer to your scalp and it keeps you cooler, right? That's an environmental adaptation, right? My skin color is an environmental adaptation. My blue eyes are they're a genetic mutation, but they stuck around because people, I guess, thought it was pretty and they didn't think that their children were possessed by the devil. If they did, they would have killed all the blue-eyed people and no one would have blue eyes anymore. But it's just a genetic mutation. There's no real benefit to having blue eyes over brown, but it's still here, right? So again, but even so, those genes there's a couple of genes that code for that, and they're just not a big difference. And so, yeah, is race biological? Well, it has a biological basis, right? Those genes are biologically encoded, but the difference is nothing. It's basically nothing. The real difference, I think, between humans has to do more so with culture. Culture is the big difference between humans, not biology. Biologically speaking, we're all the same. At least that's what the science suggests anyway. So does that help a little bit? Does that clarify a few things or raise more questions? How does that feel? Does that kind of fit with what you knew already? No? Nasra, do you want to say something or no? You're good? Yeah, it as I say, it is interesting because there's often so much weight placed on biology, particularly in a a modern world that is we're so heavily scientific, right? But again, the science here says that you know race is not a biological reality for humans. There is you were right, Nicholas. There is just one human race. That's all there is. But there's lots of different cultures and ethnicities, right? There's lots of different ways in which people have organized their world and created a belief and value system and created a system of social norms that people have to follow and rules and religions, and all of that stuff is very true, but it's not biological.
Because we're all Homo sapiens, we developed culture to separate even the biological differences
Well, no, culture is our culture is our toolbox, right? Culture is what allows us to understand how to survive in the environment and how to interact and cooperate with each other, right? That's what. So culture is our operating system, but that operating system is very dependent on where in the world you come from and what the sort of historical background of that culture is. And so, a culture that appears in the desert is going to be way different than a culture that appears in the rainforest, right? And, cultures interact over time. Sometimes they, interact negatively and get into conflict. Sometimes one overpowers the other. Sometimes cultures kind of blend together a little bit. They're kind of sort of very fluid, evolving things. But we didn't necessarily create culture to divide us. We created culture to survive. But the way in which we survive is very connected to the place that our culture develops and the way that that culture survives, the way it gets its food, the environment and the sort of elements around it. All those things will influence what a culture is. And so, yeah, they can divide us because we have different ways of seeing things, but we're not divided in that we're biologically the same. And we've all created cultures to meet our needs, right? And to survive. But all of them are uniquely different and always have been. It's interesting to think how many cultures have actually disappeared from the earth, right? All of these little hunter-gatherer groups moving around for hundreds of thousands of years, believing and telling stories about who knows what, right? Creating languages that nobody's ever heard before and never got written down and vanished again, right? The number of human cultures that have existed is, probably a huge number, and for the most part, we'll never know anything about any of them. Which is kind of sad, actually, but yeah. Okay, so I think that might be a good place to leave it here, humans. I have some quizzes to hand back to you, so I will hand them back. And then, yeah, well, let me hand them back and I'll just go over them really quickly, okay? So just give me 2 seconds here, online people. Whoa. Oh, I went to the gym yesterday. Now I can feel it. Social justice. Something else. Good. Okay. Anupik, there you are. Daniel, there you are. Oops. Change Sophie's not here. Master's here. And, okay. Good. So, all right. Let me just go over this really quickly. So, oppression, what is oppression? Right. So that's part of that answer, right? The idea that we have a system of policies and procedures and something happening in society where one group is exploited at the expense of one group is advantaged at the expense of another, right? One is denied rights and privileges, and the other one gains them. What else is going on here with oppression? What's that? Right, so, yeah, well, what is oppression? We have two groups, one of which exploits the other and sort of gains privileges and resources and opportunities at the expense of one of the others. What else is there? Yeah, so it's a system, right? It's a system in which one group is exploited at or to the benefit of the other. What else is it? Right. So oppression has to do with one group having social and institutional and social, institutional, and right, and historical power, right? So one group has those things behind it. I think it was also useful if you mentioned a dominant and a minoritized group. That would be helpful as well. Anything else that should be part of that answer? Number 2, I asked you about the experiment by Aronson and Osherow. So that's Jane Elliott's class with the blue-eyed and the brown-eyed kids. The blue-eyed kids weren't succeeding, and so what does that kind of tell us about prejudice? Say again?
It's a big factor in socialization.
What is? Prejudice is a big factor in socialization. Okay, pretty general, but give me a little bit more there. What does this experiment tell us about prejudice? Yeah, people will internalize social messages. They'll internalize prejudice and they'll act it out. What else? There's a little more to that statement, Mulder. We could add on a little bit more, but they act out these messages they receive, even if they're not true, and even if and even if it doesn't benefit them, right? So positive prejudices can have a positive effect, right? They can get people to act in different ways, but circulating a negative prejudice, people will sometimes go along with it as well, even though it doesn't benefit them. And maybe one more thing that we could say about this, about prejudice. Maybe we've already kind of implied it, but the idea that it's not real, right? The prejudice is entirely made up. There's no correlation between intelligence and eye color at all, unfortunately for me, or maybe in this case, fortunately for me. Yeah, it's entirely made up. So prejudicial ideas don't have to have any kind of truth to them, but they are circulated in society. People absorb those prejudices, and then they act them out. And sometimes they act them out even if it doesn't benefit them. What's discrimination? This is an easy one, I think. Yes. There's one thing I'm looking for in this answer. Yeah, it's action, right? So we had stereotypes and prejudice. Discrimination is where you actually act on it. You either do something, or in some cases you don't do something based on your prejudicial ideas. Number 4, that was the study with the resumes, right? And so what were the results of the study, and why did the results occur? So what were the results? Right, people with stereotype, or not people, because there were no people, there were just fake resumes. Fake resumes with stereotypically black-sounding names were much less likely to be called back for an interview, right? That's definitely what happened. And even when what? Right. Even when they changed the experiment and they made the resumes with the black-sounding names have more credentials and more experience, still black people got fewer callbacks, or black names got fewer callbacks than white names. So what's going on? What's going on here? Why is that pattern occurring? Right. So people looking over those resumes, when they see a name that's stereotypically black sounding, it triggers their prejudicial ideas about black Americans, right? They start looking at those resumes through that lens, through the lens of those stereotypes, right? And so they see those resumes differently. Does it work the same for white people, for white names? Do they see them through white stereotypes? Like we can't dance and we like to wear khakis all the time? No. To some degree, yes. But we also said that often this isn't the case for the dominant group, because the dominant group is assumed to be the neutral thing, the normal thing. So white people are not racialized in the way that people of color or black Americans are. And so, yeah, there's some stereotypes about white people for sure, right? But none of them are really triggered when looking at these resumes, right? And again, I'm not saying that that's right or fair or good, but that tends to be how it works. The minoritized group tends to trigger stereotypes, whereas the dominant group doesn't. We almost talked about this a little bit yesterday, actually, when we were talking about a terrorist attack, right? So, if somebody perpetrates an act of terror, maybe they shoot a bunch of people or run a bunch of people over. If we find out in the news that he is a Muslim, suddenly it triggers all of these stereotypes about what Muslims are like, quote unquote, right? The whole sort of terrorist stereotype and, suicide bombing and all that stuff gets, suddenly people are looking at that story through those stereotypes. But when we hear it's a white guy, does it trigger any racial stereotypes? No, we just think, oh, that guy's crazy, right? And again, the Muslim guy who did it might be crazy as well, but the thing is that we see that event through a set of stereotypes, right? And we interpret it differently, right? And the same thing is happening here. Mulder's got a thoughtful look on his.
It's religion, right?
What's that?
You're saying religion is kind of
That's true. It's true. The here we're talking about race. Really, what we're talking about is religious oppression, right? Or a religious difference. But those ideas kind of get tangled, especially when we deal with terrorism. For people in the West, the stereotypical ideas of the religion of Islam, people's ethnicity and culture, and their race, they all get kind of mashed up into one thing. And so often a prejudice against Muslims will almost be like lumped in with racism, and it's not. So here I'm kind of mixing two different types of oppression here. Here we're definitely talking about race. With the terrorist attack, it's really more of a religious. There's a religious sort of undercurrent to it. That's really what it's about. But again, I'm just kind of using it because the sort of stereotypes you're looking through can be racial, or based on gender, or based on religion, or based on citizenship or ability, or any of those things. So the process works the same, but here with the resumes, we're looking through racial stereotypes. With the news story about the terrorist attack or the mass violence, we're looking through religious ones, or sort of cultural religious ones. Same process, different thing. But you're right to point out that, yeah, being Muslim is not a race, right? Yeah, it's not. And the last one, right, the ugly face of disability hate crimes. Why is someone convicted of assaulting a person belonging to a racial or religious minority? Why do they receive more lenient sentences? We're out of time here, so I'll just say it. I was kind of flexible with this answer. Really what I was looking for is that the laws are different. The minimum sentencing laws are different, and so someone convicted of a disability hate crime just gets less time, and that's not really fair. But the other thing was that he was talking about the police don't have proper training. They don't ask about people's disability. Therefore, lawyers don't charge people with a hate crime. Therefore, judges can't sentence them. So any of those would have worked. I was looking for more the law piece, but some people answered with the other thing too, and it was close enough, so I accepted either or. Okay. That is it. We are 3 minutes over time. I apologize. Have a nice weekend. Come back here on Monday, and we'll continue to sort of untie this racism knot, if you will. Yeah.